Also, NYPD should require officers, whether a subject of a force investigation or a witness officer, to document and report all force incidents. With respect to the next area of reporting, NYPD should create a database to track data compiled from the use of force forms and publish an annual report addressing the use of force and the data being collected. With respect to training, NYPD should emphasize de-escalation training and add a specific police academy course on the subject, as well as incorporate scenario-based trainings with an evaluative component. NYPD should also increase funding and personnel at the police academy for both recruits and in-service training. With respect to the last area, discipline, in disciplinary cases where there are multiple disciplinary charges, each distinct charge should have an accompanying distinct penalty as opposed to an aggregated penalty for all counts. And NYPD should collect data regarding the disciplinary penalties and publish that data, including the number and percentages of cases in which the police commissioner, reduces or declines discipline in force cases. Before answering your questions, I would just like to acknowledge some of the team that have worked on this project.
And some of the examples you gave were quite jarring. There was one involving a bike rider in Queens and 4 officers. And can you explain what happened in that one incident? That was pretty alarming.
Sure, although let me, I'm going to let Phil talk about the details. Obviously, as you know, there is a Civil Rights Law 50A has broad restrictions on details that you can provide about individual disciplinary cases. We spend a lot of time thinking through to make sure that we can give as much appropriate detail as is permissible under the and still stay within the law. So there's not a lot of detail on those individual cases we can provide beyond what's in the report.
Well, you talked about the punches. I mean, it doesn't say the gender or the race of the officers or the subject, but I'm curious about that incident.
Well, I mean, I want to stay away from possibly violating the civil rights laws, and so I think that the descriptions of all the cases as in the report, or you have the facts in front of you of what happened there, and I would prefer not to go into too much detail.
Well, just can you tell us what happened in that incident without giving any gender or race? What happened in the incident?
I think that the facts speak for themselves.
Can you say anything about it? I mean, that's 6 punches.
Well, I'll speak more generally. I don't want to speak about anything.
If it'll help, why don't you describe the facts that are in the report?
Okay. So, a number of cases that we've dealt with have involved, the use of excessive force. That was a particularly egregious incident where, as you said, there were 4 punches made
Initially.
And that was just one of dozens of cases, obviously, that we looked at in our review, and I think it's best to.
Well, the one thing that stood out, though, was the officer with his thumbs in his belt. Can you say anything about that? The bystanders who didn't look to de-escalate.
Well, and that's one of the issues that we identified in our report, is that there are bystander officers we've identified in our investigation who if the rules were clearer, should have reported the use of force, and the policies that we are recommending that NYPD adopt would require witness officers, bystander officers in this situation and others who see fellow officers using force and require them to report it. That's the takeaway from one of the takeaways from featuring that incident.
Well, Commissioner,
let's just let a couple people go. Yes.
Did you ever consider doing that, and why didn't you end up
Sure.
doing that?
Well, the answer is we started with this data because it was the most available data, and it was the most available data, and it was a defined universe. And when you're doing a study, the first thing you need is a defined universe. We are, as we've said, by no means done. This is ongoing work, so stay tuned for additional reports. But the first thing you gotta do is start with a defined universe, and this was a clearly defined universe, and from it, by the way, a lot of, I think, very important findings.
Did the NYPD give you that data, or they resisted giving it to you?
The NYPD doesn't get to resist giving us data under local law 70.
So you guys didn't ask for it?
We asked for it in the sense that we said to them, well, you're asking, we've asked for all sorts of data. The law is very, very clear. The NYPD is to give us whatever data we seek.
Commissioner or Inspector?
Can I just ask you,
Well, go ahead.
Well, the NYPD has a press conference, as you know, scheduled for later, crime stats and the new guidelines on use of force. Do you think Commissioner Bratton is trying to get ahead of your announcement? Is it hand in hand?
Right, well, it's not hand in hand in the sense that, we're an independent entity. As to the reason that Commissioner Bratton, has chosen, last night and today to announce changes, and whether that's a pure coincidence is something you'll need to ask Commissioner Bratton. Having said that, I think it's fair to say that you wouldn't be seeing the changes that are announced on the schedule they've been announced, but for this report.
Commissioner, can I ask you and also Philip the same question? I've lived in New York 15 years. I'm just a little bit surprised that use of force is not automatically recorded. I mean, I'm a little bit stunned that I would think these kinds of incidents, and especially with the incident with Blake, the tennis player recently, that just like your reaction to this.
Our reaction, and as in the sport, is that it is absolutely unacceptable that there is not a central mechanism for tracking and reporting use of force. That's why we are very pleased that the police department has now announced that they will have a centralized mechanism for tracking force. And that's why an independent inspector general is so important, because if the independent inspector general didn't exist, you folks wouldn't have this report pointing out this problem, and we might not have a solution even to this day.
Philip, can I ask you, were you surprised?
Yes, I was surprised, and because I've been familiar with some of the practices of police departments around the country, clearly when you look at some of the what other police departments are doing, including the Los Angeles Police Department, Seattle Police Department, they have modern, state-of-the-art use of force policies. NYPD was living a little bit in the dark ages with respect to its use of force policies.
Yeah.
Amy, I know you cited a lot of statistics before, but exactly how egregious, when you compare the NYPD's use of force to other departments, how bad is it? I mean, are we the worst? Are we somewhere in the middle? Are we better?
We did not undertake that particular type of analysis. We obviously looked at some of the practices of other police departments, but if you're looking at terms of quantifying
Scale,
the use of force,
how bad is the problem?
we couldn't do that if we wanted to. Part of the problem that we identified in our investigation is that there's this inability to track use of force encounters, a comprehensive set of use of force encounters. So I couldn't, Police Commissioner Bratton or any of the very smart people who work for him couldn't answer that question if you asked them. How many force encounters have there been involving New York City police officers in a given period of time? It's just not possible to answer because there's been a lack of documentation.
And I know that you said that one of the recommendations is to have officers de-escalate the situation. But to play devil's advocate here a little bit, force may have to be used sometimes. So what exactly is what kind of balancing act should the NYPD use?
Well, obviously, as I said at the outset, there are certainly times when force is necessary, and when force is necessary to protect public safety and maintain public order, then police officers need to use force, and they need our full support in doing so. But at the same time, with that trust and support comes the obligation and the responsibility to train officers thoroughly on how to de-escalate when they can, to monitor the use of force, and to discipline officers when they improperly use force. And up to now, that's not been happening consistently. And as you can see from the report, and I'll let Phil go into the details, we found multiple instances, and this is not just, Phil and I sitting up here, this is people who come from the NYPD, with backgrounds at the NYPD and the Secret Service, found multiple instances where de-escalation was absolutely possible, and yet wasn't used, and I'll let Phil talk about that.
Right, I mean, the takeaway and the de-escalation point is that it's not always appropriate in every encounter with a civilian that a police officer might have. And so through clearly established policies and through training, officers would receive the proper guidance as to when it's appropriate to de-escalate. I got to sit in on the reviews of many, many dozens of cases and was able to hear and read the facts of how, in some instances, officers too quickly ratcheted up the tone of the encounter by escalating very quickly, as opposed to taking measures to remain calm or to affirmatively de-escalate the encounter. So the takeaway is that de-escalation is not appropriate in every encounter, but it's appropriate in a lot more encounters than what we than the cases that we do.
Just
Can I
to
ask you
follow up,
about
this
the
will be a
26, you had 26 cases where there were, I think the way I read this is that you felt that the police officer had escalated, correct? And you referred them back to the New York City Police Department for further review.
Right.
When did you do that?
So we have within the last few weeks.
Okay.
Yes.
Has there been any response at all to that from the New York City Police?
With respect to those individual instances, no, not yet.
So you have heard nothing back about the 26?
No, but I mean, I remember that under local law 70, NYPD has 90 days to respond to our report once it's released, so 90 days from today. So we would expect that we're going to receive responses to that issue and other issues raised in the report.
Forgive me, I have to answer this, sorry I'm late. But, so there were 179 incidents reported between 2010 and 2014 to CCRB by complainants. How many times did officers over that same period of time self-report on arrest records that there had been those same type of force used?
See, that's exactly, and I'm gonna steal Phil's words. It's okay, he works for me, so I'm allowed to steal his words. I'm gonna steal one word. That's exactly the problem, because there's no centralized mechanism
Right.
for tracking force and there's no centralized form for reporting force. Nobody, not me, not Phil, not Bill Bratton, not anybody, actually knows the answer to that question. There is no centralized mechanism for tracking
But I mean,
force.
I understand that, but on the complaints,
Yes.
it says in the report that they check off, if there's been an arrest, they check off that they
Right.
used force and what kind of force they used.
Got it.
So how frequently, how
Oh.
many times did they do that?
Yeah, I don't
Okay,
have that
that-
number off the top of my head. Do we have any statistics?
The number's in the report.
Did it?
Apparently 54 cases.
Oh, I thought that was 50, of the CCRB complaints in 54 they did
Yes.
that. But in general, in the police department, I'm wondering how many times they did that.
To
That's
the best of our knowledge, nobody's got.
yeah, we don't have access to that information. We don't have an answer to that question.
So we don't
Let me
know
look at that.
how frequently, but
No, our pool was, largely mostly limited to the 179 cases, substantiated CCRB cases, and that involved a variety of uses of force, and we think we were able to, paint a picture, pretty good picture of how it's used, who it's used against, and by whom. Having said that, we didn't look at force encounters outside of that pool, that very large universe, I should say.
When you say that they have 90 days to respond, it's just basically to react to your report or to suggest what changes they plan to implement? What's the difference?
The local law 70 says that they get 90 days to respond. Presumably that means to tell us whether they agree or disagree and to tell us what changes they will make if they agree.
If they disagree, they can go along without making any changes in that.
The NYPD is not obligated to follow all of our suggestions. However, I think given the reasonableness of these suggestions, I'm extremely optimistic about the way this will play out.
And we'll be tracking whether or not they implement a recommendation, whether it's addressed or not within the 90 days. I can assure you that we'll be coming back and letting the
You
public
will
know.
continue to look at these cases. then?
Yeah, and understand, part of what's important about having an independent inspector general is transparency. Everybody in this room and everybody in New York gets to see all these numbers, which wouldn't be available but for the IG. But similarly, in 90 days, everyone's going to get to see the police department's response. So if the police department decides not to make these changes, everyone gets to know that too. And that kind of transparency is perhaps the most important thing in terms of moving the ball forward.
Two questions. Have you gotten a response or indication from City Hall as to what the mayor thinks of these recommendations? And secondly, last year, Police Commissioner Bratton was at a city council hearing, and one of his remarks was that NYPD was a model of restraint. In your report today, seems to indicate there's no valid data set by which to make that type of sweeping generalization about use of force of the police department. I'm wondering if you could sort of address how people are supposed to understand how the police department has been doing up until now.
Sure. Obviously, we've briefed City Hall on this report. I'm not, as is been our practice always, we're not going to go into the details of both that briefing and their response. As to the other, while I want to be careful to make it clear that I don't think there's a lot of debate. The vast majority of police officers do incredibly hard work incredibly well. I don't believe there's a thoughtful observer that will dispute that. But there is no data, because we do not track force, or have not up until the department announced today they will now do so. But because we don't track force, there's no way, there's no data set that lets you know the level of quote restraint, close quote, your word or the commissioner's word.
It was,
Sorry,
Greg, then David.
okay, thanks.
yeah, actually, just, it's basically the cases within the CCRB universe that you're looking at. You see a number of the arrest forms where they check no, even though the video shows use of force, correct?
Well, it may not be video in all cases.
Well, whatever.
Yeah, yeah.
There's some corroborative evidence that there was use of force, but the officer or an officer checked off no.
Correct, there are cases.
Right.
Correct.
So what does that tell you about the police department or the police officers' willingness to disclose that?
What? Can I take that? We have sent those names and those incidents to the NYPD for their further review. That's the next step. Obviously, it's troubling that there are situations in which force is clearly used and a police officer checks off on a form no force was used. That's clearly troubling. We have sent those cases to the NYPD and asked for their further review. Once that further review is completed, additional intelligent decisions can get made.
I noted that, among your recommendations is not included a tracking of the force used against officers. Yet what the NYPD is planning to do and has in their new form is a section on the form that says force used against a member of service. Mm-hmm. In your studying of other departments, did you ever encounter such a tracking system elsewhere where the police were actually saying people have used force against me?
We have heard of that, and let me just
Can you say where you've seen that in the
qualify.
past?
Your statement. Although we don't explicitly call for the tracking of force used against officers, our report, however, does call in the recommendation regarding the production of an annual report for the tracking of officer injuries that were caused during those encounters. So we think, and that's an important point. We think it's important that you capture force used against officers, force used against citizens. With respect to force used against officers, obviously there are going to be applications with respect to better safety protocols and equipment. So we think that it's relevant to track and to acknowledge and be aware of all force that's involved in these encounters.
What other departments track it in such a close way? I mean, this is
Right? Then you can be spot checking. When I learn about force from other avenues, did it get appropriately reported on the centralized form? If I see that it isn't getting reported, if on a regular basis it's not getting reported, then I know I need to take steps and I can figure out where those steps need to be taken.
If I could just add to that briefly, I mean, one of the advantages of having an independent office like this study this issue is that you can look at all the different types of solutions to that problem. The question is, how do you ensure that officers report the use of force? Well, our report attempts to answer that question. You come up with clearly established policies, you educate officers about those policies, you institute training for officers, making it very clear what is appropriate, what is not appropriate. You collect the data, you analyze the data, and you have a disciplinary system that holds officers accountable when they resort to excessive use of force. Only by combining these various elements in a cohesive manner in the way that we've laid out in the report can you increase the chances that officers will report force, or bystander officers will report force when they see subject officers using it.
Garner, about training officers to de-escalate, are you seeing that that's not really happening, or that it needs to
to do more, or?
As, you can,
We've been working on this for many months, this project. And so, we've heard that they've been working on developing their use of force policy. They've known that since the beginning of the year that we've been looking at this issue as well. And so we're going to hear more this afternoon, I think, from the police department about what they're proposing to do. But I have every reason to believe that they've been working in good faith to develop new policies, to learn what other police departments are doing. And I think that our recommendations, which we've also been working on for a long time, will go a long way towards performing use of force policies in the police department.
Commissioner, the believable.
I think, and I'll let Phil talk to this. Obviously, part of the reason for having an independent inspector general is so that a year from now, after we finally have these forms and after this is implemented, and there's been some time to see it implemented, Phil and his team can go back and pull bunches of these reports and go and see whether or not these are being reported accurately. The whole reason for having an independent inspector general that is here forever is expressly so that, a year after this rolls out, we can go look and see are people accurately filling out the forms.
And if I could just add to that answer, supervisors play a key role in ensuring the integrity of these forms and ensuring that they're accurately repeated. There's some discussion in our report about the key role that that supervisors play in this regime. So yes, a combination of supervisory controls, auditing by NYPD or by an outside entity like ourselves, and enhancing disciplinary system accountability. I think that's going to again increase the chances that these forms are being properly filled out. You're not going to get 100% compliance, but by putting in the right mechanisms in place, you're going to increase the chances that officers are filling out these forms fully to the best of their recollection, and that's going to help NYPD over the long term reform its use of force policies, understand what's happening even more.
In the cases you saw, in the 54 of the arrests that were not reported on 61, did police officers knowingly lie about not having used force when they did?
Sitting here now, we have no evidence that anyone knowingly lied.
Are you saying that you think no one knowingly lied?
I chose my words pretty carefully. We don't have any evidence sitting here now that anyone lied. We've asked the NYPD to review this. Once the NYPD conducts their review, we will obviously know a lot more. But I want to be very clear.
Well, let me jump in for a second.
Sure.
That's true. We don't know is the bottom line takeaway. But I just want to make sure that we're clear about what we said in our report. The reporting officer, the officer who reported the use of force may not have been the subject officer in many of those cases. So it may have been someone who didn't actually see what happened or whose view was obstructed. And so we don't claim to have complete understanding of what happened, which is why we referred it to NYPD for their review.
And and why we will, and once that happens, then we will continue to look.
Commissioner James Blake was mentioned by one of the other reporters. Was he spoken to as part of this investigation?
No, he wasn't spoken to. And if I could just follow up real quickly on your earlier question about the incident involving the complainant.
Right.
It was a 26-year-old complainant was riding his bicycle, was approached by an officer. The officer asked for ID. The complainant was visibly upset with the officer asking for his ID. With very little provocation, if any, the officer, in a matter of seconds, ended up punching the officer first once, twice, 3 times.
He didn't punch the officer.
I'm sorry.
Oh,
The
yes,
other
yeah.
way around. I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. Let me go and calm down for a second.
Okay.
The officer ended up punching the complainant first once, first twice, 3 times, 4 times. There were other officers on the scene, and it wasn't until after the officer had punched the complainant a 5th and 6th time that a bystander officer actually intervened, put his hand, I think, on the shoulder, perhaps, of the officer. So that was a particularly egregious instance where a bystander officer saw what happened, didn't intervene earlier, where an officer ratcheted up things very quickly, and a lot of the problems that we identified in our report are are distilled into that particular scenario that we described.
Do you know if that particular incident had an arrest for? Was there an arrest in that case? Do you know?
I believe, we're checking on that. I can't remember that offhand if there was.
We'll
an
get back,
arrest. Yeah.
we'll get back to you.
you on that.
We'll get back to you. We'll check and get back to you.
We're gonna wrap up in about.
Sorry, can you say the
couple
date of
more
that? Not the exact date, but the year that that happened?
I don't have that in front of me. I'm not sure we would even reveal that.
I don't know that we reveal it, but if we will,
Yeah.
we'll get back to you.
We'll get back to you.
Okay, just the year, not the exact date.
Yeah, we'll be able to
Just a-
determine if we can share it with you.
Very quick question. When did you first give this report to the police department? And were there plans to release it last week and they asked you to delay it a week?
They did not ask, the answer is, we shared